A study by McKinsey and Company found that knowledge workers spend up to 1.8 hours every day looking at the information they need just to do their job. That means companies are losing thousands of hours of productivity every year, not because people aren't working, but because they can't find what they need. They can't find the context. When you multiply that across hundreds of millions, potentially even a billion knowledge workers globally, it adds up to tens of trillions of just lost productivity, lost cost every year. And again, it's not because people aren't working, but because they simply can't find what they need. They can't find the context. I've spent a decade building complex systems for companies that work with some of the largest enterprises in the world. And this problem shows up over and over again. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why this problem exists and how AI is about to fundamentally change how companies access and work with their collective intelligence. Look, ultimately, companies were never really designed around understanding, which, I scratch my head every now and then and ask why. They were designed around storage, workflow, and departmental control or control. Over time, every new layer of enterprise software has solved sort of like this very one narrow problem around that same sort of ontology of a company setup. Email solved communication, shared drives solved storage, CRM kind of solved customer records, wikis and like stored sort of solved documentation. Then Slack sped up messaging, Jira kind of tracked work, but only in certain departments. And that was a problem, right? Each one created its own little island of context, or not even context, information. So the modern company doesn't really have a single brain. It has like these pieces that are all decentralized, and it has potentially hundreds of disconnected memory fragments spread across the tools, the teams, and really spread across time. And this is why so much of a person's day goes in actually rebuilding context, or going back and saying, well, how do we arrive here? Or actually, in some cases, relitigating the same discussion. And the deeper issue here is that most companies are storing artifacts, not meaning. Kind of what do I mean by that? They're storing files, they're storing messages, tickets, folders, transcripts, dashboards. These contain meaning, but they are in themselves not meaning. And decisions don't live neatly inside just a single artifact or a single bit of information. They kind of transcend across all of them. And this is the why behind why something is usually scattered across a meeting, a Slack thread, an email, in someone's head, a team discussion, 3 revisions of a document where everyone has a slightly different version of that revision. And so even when the information technically exists, it's not actually available in a usable form for everyone. And then there's the human layer. We model work through handoffs and meetings. We spend a lot of time getting in sync. I send you something, you send it on. Someone else picks it up later. It's a slightly loosely coupled workflow where it's really reliant on that human-to-human communication to continuously get back in sync. In one of the pieces we wrote, the analogy was simple. People are effectively locked in separate rooms, passing notes under the door, and no one sees the full picture, and no one builds properly on top of what others have already discovered. The result is not just fragmentation of data, but really it's fragmentation of understanding. It's an absolute absence of compounding. And the same problem is actually now manifesting its way into the digital world we're building, because we're still stuck in those rooms and we're still trying to pass notes from under the door. It's kind of like having filing cabinets connected by messaging pipes, when actually companies need is shared evolving context, which can compound on each other. Look, the obvious cost is time. People lose hours asking, rereading, cross-checking, recreating knowledge that the company or someone in the company had already generated once. And I use the word generated, but created or thought through. The real cost, though, I think is a lot more than search time. It shows up in duplicative work. 2 teams are working on the same problem. A new employee joins in. They have to rebuild the context that had already existed 6 months later. A product decision is then getting relitigated because the rationale was never captured in a durable way that someone could pick up on. So the company keeps spending money, not because it lacks intelligence, but because the intelligence is just simply not compounding. And One of the biggest things I see this isn't just in meetings, right? You have a meeting and then you have another meeting a week later. It's the same recurring meeting. And what you start to see is people say, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. And this happened last week. And then the next week shows up and you don't see that actually we compounded, we moved forward, and we didn't actually close the loop, which is a really important part of the process. Look, fragmentation ultimately degrades decision quality or decision-making quality. When context is incomplete, people default to the loudest voice, the newest document, the easiest thing to find. And that is dangerous because the most accessible answer is often the most inaccurate one. Sometimes if you imagine you're taking off from Dubai and you're going to Los Angeles, you sort of take off 2 degrees in the wrong direction. You could end up in the North Pole versus ending up in LA. And I think that's a really important thing to sort of recognize about what this issue really becomes. There's also the hard financial layer to this. In the broader enterprise software world, we've already seen how much organizations are trying to force generic systems to match the actual way they do work. But actually that feels like a bit of an oxymoron. One of the studies that we did sort of before, we realized that for every $100,000 you spent in, say, a CRM system, companies were spending between $700,000 and $900,000 a year in customization just to make it fit. So my question really is, then what'd you buy the software for? And that is the same structural problem in just another form. The software does not hold the company's real context. At best, it's holding a partial version of it. And so the companies are paying endless amounts of money, not only to customize, but to connect the context so that all the other different systems that they spent 7 times the subscription amount on can actually talk to each other. And so you can start to get some resemblance of a holistic view. So the cost is threefold: lost productivity, degraded decisions, and non-compounding organizational intelligence. Companies are not just paying to store information, they're paying again and again for the consequences of not truly understanding what they have. Because ultimately, if you think about a lot of what we're seeing with language models and ChatGPT and like right now it's missing understanding. When we think about knowledge bases or internal wikis, or if you just put a ChatGPT on top of it, really what you're doing is you're replacing the search query with natural language, but it's still trying to retrieve a set of files. It's not trying to retrieve a set of understanding. And that goes down to the fundamental issue of the platforms underneath. Knowledge bases and wikis assume that if people documented enough, the problem would go away. But documentation decays, right? It's living and breathing. It goes stale the minute the world changes within a company. And search engines are really improving recall. Language models that are then, sort of pulling in files are improving search, because search, had all those wildcards and characters and those things inside them. But really, in most cases, what's happening is you're using ChatGPT, and let's just say it's plugged into your Google Drive, to retrieve a list of files, and then it's stuck trying to find those files. And so effectively you had language model to search queries, switch query to files, and then boom, you're sending a bunch of files into the RAG to try and figure out, what's in them. Getting 12 files out of a search of terabytes of data is a great starting point, but it doesn't give you the full context. And this is why these tools often feel really useful in the beginning, but very disappointing at scale. They make access easier, but they don't really create a living model of the company's knowledge. There's a letter I wrote to the former British Prime Minister, and there was this one line about that we're still in the AOL days. The interface got easier, but the underlying technology was really far from its potential. I still think we're in the later days of that same period. We've made it easier to search, we've made it easier to generate, interfaces have got a lot friendlier, they feel a lot more human-like, but underneath, the systems still treat knowledge as pages, files, and string, rather than these evolving concepts with context, provenance, relationship, evolution. Just imagine, for example, you have a discussion and you meet someone new or you read something new. Wouldn't it be great to know how that actually permeated or propagated through the organization? And then how did it drift and change? Tools we have today just don't allow us to do that. And traditional tools also failed because they were fundamentally static, while organizations are really dynamic, and you want to unlock velocity, not lock it up. A wiki page is frozen until someone goes and updates it. And by the time that someone's gone and updated it, the content that they updated might have already become stale. And so these systems become libraries without librarians. They accumulate content, but they don't really help organize the reason behind them. And there was a really interesting theory, I think we covered it in an earlier podcast about Price's Law, which is the square root of any community produces more than 50% of the outcome. And look, I have to believe that a part of that is just the overhead in sharing context and making sure that everyone's up to speed. And you kind of think about it, if you're 4 people around a table, you can keep having conversation. You're not reliant on everything being documented all the time. But even if you do see something wrong, you'll know it's wrong. But when you're 20 people, 30 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, that just becomes really hard. And that's why, there was this saying, repetition is a prayer, because you often were just repeating the same thing again and again. And so you spent more time educating out and less time innovating forward. And finally, look, I think a part of these systems is they failed because they mirror human bureaucracy. They're linear, they're asynchronous, they're siloed. In a piece I'd done on agents, we kind of described that a lot of these systems are still working or behaving like it's the 1990s, isolated, a little bit like baton passing, waiting, blind to what came before. And that is really true of enterprise knowledge tools as well. They were built for handoffs, not for shared cognition. So the short answer is, knowledge bases, search engines, and wikis did not solve the problem, because the problem was never about storage or about search. The problem was that companies lacked a shared memory layer that could really preserve meaning as it evolved and as it propagated and as it drifted. So if I had to summarize the whole thing in one sentence, I'd say, look, companies don't suffer from a lack of information. They suffer from a lack of shared, trusted, evolving understanding, especially as they become bigger. Before I go deeper into this, if you run a company or lead a team, the problem is probably costing you far more than you realize. Most organizations lose hundreds of hours a year simply because knowledge inside the company is fragmented across tools, systems, documents, conversations, and whatnot. I put together a free research briefing called The AI Memory Gap that explains why this happens, why current AI tools still struggle with organizational knowledge, and the new architecture that's emerging to solve it. If you want to understand how this will change how companies operate over the next couple of years, not even a decade, you can download the free briefing in the description below. The future company looks a lot less like a stack of software tools and a lot more like a living cognitive system. Instead of every department maintaining its own partial truth, the organization has a shared memory layer across humans, across agents, and across teams of humans and agents. And it's not a folder system. It's not a wiki graveyard. It's not a search bar pointing to a stale set of documents. It's a living memory that knows what happened, why it mattered, how it changed, and what it connects to. In one of the analogies we've already used, today's teams often look like they're locked in separate rooms, passing notes under the door. The future company is the opposite. It's a team standing in front of a giant shared glass where all ideas are visible, context is alive, contradictions are obvious, and everyone can build on what they've already discovered. And that's so important. That means that companies' intelligence no longer depends on what happens to remember something, who was in the meeting, who has been there the longest. Memory becomes institutional rather than tribal. AI helps preserve the rationale behind the decisions, the evolution of the ideas, the propagation, the drift, and the relationships of these concepts over time, so that when someone joins, they don't just inherit files, but they actually get an inherent understanding and a read-up of the history up till now for the things that they're going to be working on. It also means that AI becomes a part of the organizational fabric of the company. And that's really important, rather than just a separate tool that people use. It sits underneath workflows, the way memory sits under thought. It helps teams reason in parallel, not just operate in sequence. It gives businesses a living map of understanding, a shared substrate of evolving thought. And ultimately, this is the real vision. Not AI as a clever assistant on the side, but AI as the memory infrastructure of the company. The interface may feel conversational, but the real breakthrough is a lot deeper than chat. As I put it in an earlier writing, we're still in the AOL days when this interface is coming together. And whilst the interfaces become easier, the underlying technology has not really reached its true potential. We're starting to see lots of that with OpenClaw and others in recent times, but there's still a long way still to go. So look, the future is a company where intelligence and knowledge compound, when knowledge does not decay the moment someone leaves, when decisions remain legible through authority and time, where agents and humans work from the same evolving map, and where the organization finally stops confusing stored information with real understanding. One of the biggest problems with AI today is that it still doesn't understand meaning. If you want to understand why that matters and how it creates massive opportunities for business, watch this video.